Hi, my name's Simon Lee. The reason I'm doing this video is because I have been putting up routes at High Tor for, well, 39 years. And a couple of the more recent ones that I've put on had bolts on them and they were chopped. The bolts were chopped from a route called Big Cigar, which was a, a 7C sport route which started up Castellan, and also a route that I did last Friday called Storming, which took a parallel line to the right of Bastille. And there was a bolt to protect the boulder problem start, and a bolt. They went to a bolt belay, which also had its bolts taken out, even though that bolt had been in place for 5 years or so. So I thought it'd be good to do it as a video because I could illustrate it with pictures, because High Tor is quite a complicated crag, and it would be more obvious what's gone on, rather than just try to write it down on forum posts and all of it. So Alan James at Rockfax kindly provided me with some high resolution pics, and hopefully I'll be able to illustrate what's gone on. So I was going to initially go through a bit about High Tor and its main face. I was then going to go through the history of fixed gear at High Tor on the main face, and then I was going to talk about all the bolts that currently exist on trad routes on the main face, and then sort of more generally about changes in attitudes to trad climbing, and then actually go through in more detail at the end about the thinking of behind establishing the two routes themselves, Big Cigar and Storming. So to start off, as I said, my name is Simon Lee. I've started climbing at High Tor in probably 1984 when I was at university there. So I've been climbing there for 40 years, and put up my first trad routes. Well, there were trad routes in whilst I was still at university, and I probably put up 12, 14 routes in total over the last 39 years. I think High Tor has been described as the best outcrop crag in the country. I think that's pretty well deserved. It's a pretty amazing sort of sheet of limestone, and as a student we used to go out on the bus. I'm there very regularly from Nottingham. It was from Nottingham to Matlock. So first of all, generally about the main phase, that I would say is that I regard we've got pictures of the left and the right. So from a personal point of view, looking at the cursor, there's the line down here is Castellan, which is a very famous E5 in extreme rock, put up by, well, it was an aid route that was freed by John Allen and Steve Bang. And to the left of this, the rock is of variable quality, particularly, well, when I say variable quality, it's pretty much choss here and here. But the routes rightwards of here are all of kind of very good quality, and that's what I regard as the base. As you see, there's a little bit of over there. I think most of the routes at High Tor have fixed gear of one sort or another, pegs, threads, and bolts. So it's not unusual to have bolts on trad routes at High Tor. The existence of a bolt or a handful of bolts on a route isn't necessarily means it's no longer a trad route, particularly at High Tor where there's a long history of that sort of thing. The bolts are obviously are more contentious than threads, and more contentious than pegs, because pegs are put in sort of natural features, though pegs can create their own problems in terms of the long term when they needed to be replaced. So the first bolt that I'd like to, well, I'll start from left to right. The first, the route that had the first free climbing bolt placed in Derbyshire was by Steve Bancroft in the late 70s on lime crime, which is a classic it was E3 and now it's E4, been upgraded to E4. The bolt's terrible. It's in slightly the wrong place. Personally, I don't even clip it when I repeat lime crime these days. But it's a precedent. The bolt was put in for free climbing. It's never been chopped. It's still there. Yeah, part of the history of High Tor. The second route is a route called Brompton's Crocktail. It starts up to the right of lime crime, very overgrown at the moment. Hard moves over the roof here, and then goes into the lime crime belay, and then takes a line up here. And there are twin bolts up here to protect hard moves up here. I haven't done the route, so I can't really sort of comment about the crux or anything. And also I should mention that what's called the Castellan tree, which is the main way of getting down off the main face by abseil, is to abseil off this tree, which has got a chain around it. It's an ash. Its roots are very obvious on the rock. It's sort of slightly below the edge of the face. And in fact, I placed a bolt there last year or the year before to back up the chain, because the tree had been marked for felling due to sort of ash dieback by Derbyshire Dales District Council. And A, I wanted to back the chain up, and also B, I didn't want the chain to disappear when they fell the tree. So that's another bolt that's been placed. That hasn't been chopped. So moving across to Darius, there's a bolt high up there where the cursor is on the right hand picture, been fallen on many times. I'm not quite sure of the original origin of the bolt there, but what I do know is that it came out in the 80s, and the note in the guidebook history section says that it was replaced by popular demand. So again, the existence of a bolt on a trad route, widely accepted and appreciated. Moving right again, we've got original route, which takes the obvious groove line up the centre of the crag, and it's a two-pitch route, and you belay here, and there's a potential top pitch that goes here and then up, but it's pretty scrappy and not very nice to climb. And people have quite often chosen not to do the top pitch and just abseil straight off. And in the past, there was a spike that was sort of driven into the back of the ledge with a hoop on it, and you could abseil off or top rope the route or whatever off that. That disappeared, perished or was taken out, I'm not sure. But Seb Grieve, somebody I climbed with at university, he placed abseil, so two bolts for sort of belaying and abseiling off here. But that was back in the 80s. They were obviously getting past their sell-by date, and I think about 6-7 years ago Ian Carr put a couple of glue-in bolts. Again, nobody has particularly expressed a problem with them that I'm aware of until recently. I think, they're pretty much greatly appreciated by all. I think a lot of people wouldn't be very happy if they disappeared. So that's that. And then moving across, the central sort of groove is Bastille. And to the left of Bastille, there is a route that was put up by Malk Taylor in, I guess, in the late 80s. I think I was there when he was trying it, actually, thinking it. And it's got a couple of bolts in it. And you access it from the first bolt of Bastille, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then you clip these two bolts, and apparently there's a run out here. It's given E6 6C. I don't know anybody that's repeated it. So that's that. And then we turn to Bastille, which is again in extreme rock, and it's got about 6 or 7 bolts in it, but is always classed as a trad route, 6, originally given E5, but now given E6. There was an aid route that was freed, and the bottom section was particularly hard, and it's done with a couple of points of aid before, actually totally free climbed. I don't think anybody's too sure who did the first proper full free ascent of of Bastille. The bolts, I did it when on the aid bolts. I led it in 88. And then looking at the rock facts notes, it looks like Adrian Berry replaced the sort of 2 key ones at the bottom with newer bolts. Though there has been commented that the second one is higher than the old one, sure. And there's certainly a replacement newer bolt on the upper wall. So there's that. Moving right, there was my bolt on storming to protect the boulder problem start of the route, which you could clip from just above the ground by stretching off an cut. And then you've got a route called Passion Wagon, which was given 7B, but has been described in the guide as not really a sport route, which has got 2 bolts up here that was put up by Mark Pretty, late 80s, early 90s. And there's apparently some nut belay buried in the undergrowth in this sort of gully there. So that's a tour of all the bolts that I'm aware of on the main face. So as you can tell, you can conclude bolts on trad routes on high tour, A, not unusual, B, never been removed on ethical grounds. So, well, until last weekend. Just talk a little bit more generally about changes of taste and popularity of trad routes. When I first started climbing, there wasn't really sport climbing. Bouldering was just kind of messing around. So trad climbing was the only game in town, and I was really keen on Chi Tour at the time when I first started, and you had to queue for routes there. My thought at the time was, my goodness, if it's going to be this popular now, what's it going to be like in 10, 15, 20 years time? It's going to be rammed. And you go to Chi Tour now, and it's clearly not as frequented as it was back then. Routes have a tendency to get overgrown, and people got different branches of climbing to do, sport climbing and bouldering, which I should say involve a lot less faff in terms of actually doing the climbing, whereas trad climbing, obviously, with the setups and all the rest of all the gear and all of it is more sort of logistically problematic, as well as being. So yeah, I think there's a general point to be made that across the UK, a lot of the old trad routes have become overgrown. They've and as being overgrown, they get climbed less, and so it becomes a sort of vicious circle, and it's a bit of a shame, really. So you can put a bolted line in that's very poor rock, as many of the quarries in the Peak District, and it gets hundreds of cents. And you have a better quality route on natural limestone, and it doesn't get climbed for decades, and gets overgrown, which is a shame. And I think there's a balance to be had between making things more approachable in terms of how you can climb them, as well as sort of respecting the traditions of climbing, but without putting the history of climbing too much on a pedestal. So I'll talk more specifically now about Big Cigar and storming. My thought processes in terms of establishing them then in the first place. And if you skip to this part straight away, then date stamp it if you can. I think that's the correct phrase. So anyway, if we just home in on this part of the cliff. So as I mentioned earlier, you've got Castellan, which sort of climbs out of this roof and then goes up this crack line, relay around here, a couple of hard moves here, and then it's relatively top. And when you abseil off the what we call the Castellan tree from the top of the crag, there's a very obvious unclimbed rib to the right of it. And I always thought it'd be a tremendous thing to climb because it's nice and pocketed, and it's amazingly exposed as well. So I thought about different ways to do it, and there's a route to the right called Party in the Park, which Neil Foster put up 10-12 years ago, and initially I was thinking about sort of stepping in to it from there, but then Neil suggested, why not do it from stepping in from Castellan? So I ended up doing that. I did explore trying to find a way between the two, but the gap's pretty narrow. The rock quality isn't very good. It would have needed reinforcing. And I also looked at a sort of direct start into Castellan. I think I might have left a bolt there actually, but I ruled that out for some reason. I mainly did it. I think I mainly put the rope in so you could stick clip it and maybe do the whole thing as a sport route, but it didn't work. So in the end, I climbed the roof of a Castellan, which is the crux, quite well protected, but flipping hard. I reckon it's Sport 7B. And then you step right onto the rib, climb all the way up here, and then there's a belay out here that you can have off if you want, or you can just more easily scramble to the top. So you can see there were sort of several ideas about how to do it. One thing that I didn't appreciate at the time was that there's a sort of a diagonal route across here called Fantasia. I never did it, and what I didn't take into account was that it actually crosses. Probably crosses about here, and one of my bolts is en route, as it were. And I didn't actually, even though I put the route up 8 years ago, I didn't realise about that until I think it was last year when Tom Briggs mentioned it on UK Bouldering. He thought it was a detraction from the route, and I was thinking I'd probably take it out because it didn't actually affect the run out on the route that much. But then I spoke to the first ascensionist, John Codling, who did the first ascent of Fantasia, and he was pretty relaxed about it. He thought it wouldn't make a difference. He thought it was all quite reasonably protected there. And I've spoken to a couple of people who've also recently done Fantasia, and they were actually quite happy that the bolt was there. So I was in a little bit of a quandary about whether to take this bolt out or not. But what Tony Stone did was that he chopped all the bolts, not just take that one out. He chopped the belay above, here, 2 bolts with 2 malons on. I think it's 4 bolts underneath. So it was a response to affecting Fantasia. Then that response was well over the top. That's probably as much as I need to say about Big Cigar. I'll go on to the this side where storming is. Again, just going through the sort of thought processes of how to establish the route. I'd a few weeks ago done a sort of counter diagonal crossing tails and reproduction and Bastille ending up about here and climbing up into this recess. I'd also accessed this recess from a higher counter diagonal called Dementia. It's a really good pitch across here, probably at about E4. And in fact, I'd looked at it in the 80s, and I'd put a peg in there with a view to maybe sorting out a fixed belay, but there wasn't much else to put in there. But when I went back to do Dementia, I added a bolt because the single peg wasn't enough and there wasn't anything else to put in there. And it was the obvious place to have a belay. So that was put in about 6 years ago, that bolt. And again, that's one that Tony has chopped. So when I did this counter diagonal, I'd abseiled down this face, and it became obvious again, I'd seen it in the past, that there was a good upper wall to the right of Bastille. Really good rock, really interesting holds. Slightly, hardish moves above gear, but good gear. But the thing was how do you access, this section? So I was aware of the other routes in the vicinity. You've got Bastille that obviously runs here and accesses the flaky wall. You've got a route called Tumbril, and it was a bit uncertain where Tumbril. Well, I thought Tumbril started here. It's certainly where it's. By the way, all the lines on Rockfax and the BMC guide, take a bit of responsibility that because I took a lead role in writing that section of the guide, are wrong. So it's shown in the guide as sort of starting up here, Tumbril. And I thought, well, the best way, you'd have a really good up and down line if you just climbed up basically parallel to Bastille. But the problem is this section of rock, whilst it's really good quality, there's no gear. So I contacted the first ascensionist, Ed Cleesby, who put up Tumbril in 79 or 80, something like that. And he said he definitely remembers there being protection on it. But he didn't remember much else about it. And he was actually very open to it being having had a bolt added if I felt that was a good idea. But then afterwards it occurred to me that I'd actually belayed Seb on Tumbril, and where all this ivy is, I've actually cleared the ivy out. Where the ivy is, you could. That's where Tumbril actually started. There's a poor cam here across the sort of slab and up, join this other route, Decadence, I'll talk about in a second. So then I realised, actually, this bit hasn't been climbed. It's a really good way. You'd have a hard start and then sort of a little bit bold joining a route called Decadence, follow Decadence all the way up here as Tumbril did, and then Tumbril just went left of the gully. In fact, Seb went into the gully to put tar for 3 to protect it. But instead you step back left and you climb this really good wall, and it would be a really good route, especially if you haven't done Decadence before. and the bolts wouldn't affect any other routes, and it didn't look visually out of place because you got the two starting bolts of Bastille immediately to the left, and you've got the two bolts on Passion Wagon up to the right. So it seemed an obvious thing to do. So I put the bolt in. It was harder starting than I assumed it would be. I reckon it's English 6C, maybe font 7A to start, and the whole route I thought was probably easy E6. But what was interesting, weird, was that Crispin Waddy had spotted the sort of potential of the upper wall as well. And I happened to be Abingdon when he was there that day. And he was originally going to start up Decadence, which starts here, or if you've got blinkers on, over the bulge here, but, shuffling along this break and moving up and across. And then there's a sort of load of flakes up here. And it crosses into Bastille and takes a belay on the bolts of Bastille. Second bit. So he was going to start up Decadence and then go up the top wall. But then he'd seen my bolt, even though I'd taken the hanger off, they had a play on it. I said, well, put the bolt in. I think I claim to that, your idea of Decadence. But in the end, we teamed up, and instead of starting up Decadence, he decided to start up Bastille and do it that way. And that day he actually climbed it, called it what do you call it? But basically it was named after an Icelandic volcano that may or may not have caused the French Revolution. You'll have to look into it to understand that, because Bastille's obviously to do with the French Revolution. Tumbril is. So yeah, he did it that day. I failed to get through the start of my route. As I said, it was pretty hard for me. Maybe not hard for most E6 climbers. And then we came back a couple of days later, and I actually got through the start, but I made a mess of it, and I got pumped out on Decadence. And then nicely, a couple of days after that was last Friday, I came out with Seb Grieve, who I said put my first routes up at High Tour. We put our first routes up at High Tour together back in 1985. So it was really nice to go back with him. I got through start straight away, then a hold exploded on Decadence, but I did it next go. So happy days, delighted. It's a really good, well balanced route now. You've got the boulder problem start. Most people, climb that grade, shouldn't find any problem. They might fall off a couple of times, but it's a good sort of on-siteable or ground-up type of challenge. In terms of historical oddities, I should mention about another route called Musical Women that was put up by Pete Livesey, and it was in the original Derwent guide, but then subsequently left out because it was kind of superseded by other routes. So that went up. In fact, the only person I know who's repeated Musical Woman is a guy called Mark Mitchell I used to climb with when I was at university, Mad Mitch as he was known, and he basically climbed all the routes on my tour. So it started up Bastille and traversed across and sort of joined my route, just above the crux at this decent cam slot, and then sort of followed Decadence and took this belay on Bastille. Then it dropped down beneath the crux of Flaky Wall, and then moved across here and took a line up here. Now Simon Nadin later did this section of the route, but starting here and then flake up, and that's a much more direct line, and it was regarded that superseded Musical Women, and Musical Women was left out of the out of the guides. In fact, Chris Plant sort of flagged up that actually Musical Women wasn't on the UKC logbook, so I added it, for historical reasons. So yeah, so I would say, the summary is, I didn't think there was an issue at all with any of the bolts that I put in, other than one that affected Fantasia. I was a bit on the fence about that. Otherwise, none of them affected other routes. And in the history of high tour, and if you've listened from the start, it's a long history of bolts, both aid bolts that got used for free climbing and bolts that were put in for free climbing. None of them have been taken out so far. So this business of taking out all these bolts is without precedent, and quite frankly, chopping them, is quite an aggressive thing to do. It wasn't taking the hangers out and say, let's have a discussion. And I think it was driven in part by personal feelings. If you look at the post that Tony Stone has made on UKB, he clearly does not like me. And, it seems a little bit of a coincidence that the routes that he's chosen to take bolts out of are all mine. Although there is one exception. Apparently somebody recently put an extra bolt to start my new hat from around here as an independent start rather than starting by Bastille. Don't know who that was. And in fact, why would you take that bolt out? It's the start of a bolted route. It doesn't affect anybody else. Why would you take that out? So it seems like an aggressive action. It seems unprecedented. It's pretty upsetting that what he's done has effectively severely, it's actually made it impossible to climb Storming or Big Cigar in the way that I put them up. And it also makes it problematic in terms of the two traverses that reach here, that you can no longer belay on unless you're prepared to belay on a single peg. So I think that's probably about it. If you've got any questions, ask me on the forums, but hopefully being able to illustrate this makes it a lot more clear. Thanks for listening.